Ladies and gentlemen, thank you all for coming. My name is Tim Carney. I am a senior fellow here at the American Enterprise Institute. A lot of you are familiar faces, but if it's your first time here, we are a think tank, public policy research think tank here in Washington, D.C. We've got four departments. Our oldest, I think, is economics. We have foreign and defense policy, domestic policy, but today you are guests of the newest department here at AEI, the Social, Cultural, and Constitutional Studies Policy. And I like to brag about SCCS existing because I think as a think tank forming this a few years ago under the leadership, Robert Doar formed it and handed over to Yuval Levin, who's our boss, and the idea is that culture needs to be studied. Cultural conditions are causal factors. They matter, they deserve study, they explain things just as much as economic realities or policies or armies and soldiers and dollars and cents do. And so today, the book we'll be talking about and the author we'll be listening to is a great examination of our culture. I want to tell you first, I'm also a journalist, and I have a bad habit when it comes to questions of religion, of reveling when I see major newspapers make glaring mistakes in their coverage of religion, especially Christianity. One of my favorites was when the Washington Post misquoted the Hail Mary, and somehow it made it through 8 lines of editors who didn't know what that is. Also, more recently, there was a famous one about the new Pope saying his first Mass, and the quote was, "Alleluia," he intoned reverently in Latin. Again, I should have more mercy on these editors. But another that still gets me was a Politico writer who went on MSNBC to talk about Christian nationalism, which she defined as the Christians who believe that their rights come not from the government, but from God. So she wasn't against the Christians, it was just a Christian nationalist. So this is some of the ignorance that exists in the major media about religion and about Christianity. And a major exception when it comes to this has been Molly Worthen, who's been covering religion, who's a professor at University of North Carolina in basically the history of religion in the United States. And she's been writing about it in major outlets such as the New York Times and the Atlantic for well over a decade. And she was a great exception for years to she was a rare secular journalist who could write well about Christianity. And I'm going to read very quickly before I bring her up here about a review of her 2013 book, Apostles of Reason. So this was a book that looked at evangelical Christianity in America. And at the Gospel Coalition, Albert Mohler wrote, "This is a book to be reckoned with. In terms of its comprehensive grasp of the evangelical movement, its detailed research, and its serious approach of understanding the evangelical mind, Apostles of Reason stands nearly alone in the larger world of academic publishing. Any serious-minded evangelical should read it. That said, it is also infuriating." So that was a grudging respect from a reviewer. And unfortunately, though, there's one less excellent secular commentator on American Christianity, because about 3 years ago, Molly was baptized in a Southern Baptist church. And now in the more recent years, she's written this book that we're here to talk about tonight. Spellbound, How Charisma Shaped American History from the Puritans to Donald Trump. And I have to say, Molly, is there really that big of a gap, that much daylight between Puritans and Donald Trump? They don't drink. They have strong views on the ostentatious display of wealth. But no, Molly, thank you very much for joining us. Thank you all for coming here. Molly Worthen.
Thanks so much, Tim, for that kind introduction. And thank you all for being here. It's a weeknight. People are so busy. I really appreciate it. My plan is to take about 20 minutes to sketch out some of the big ideas of this book before we get into a conversation about it. So I'm hoping to tell you about a way of thinking about charisma that has helped me pull together some patterns across American history and also in our own time. And I want to suggest that to understand politics, we have to keep theology front and center. We shouldn't keep the history of Pentecostals speaking in tongues with their hands in the air over here, and then the history of respectable secular political movements over there, because actually they are one story. When I started this project about 10 years ago, I confused charisma with charm. I thought I would be writing about a lot of really charming people, people with high emotional intelligence who are really good at working the room. I also associated charisma with excellent public speaking. Now, charm and inspiring oratory showed up here and there in the people I found myself writing about, but really more in the breach than as part of the broad pattern. I realized that the key giveaway of charisma is its deeply polarizing effect on people. Charismatic leaders have a lot of people who adore them and a lot of people who loathe them, and not very many who are just lukewarm. Let me give you the definition of charisma that I finally settled on. Charisma is a relationship between leaders and followers based on telling a story. A charismatic leader invites followers into a compelling narrative that does a better job of making sense of their lives than other narratives on offer in the culture. But if you happen to be outside of that story, then this leader is baffling and maybe even revolting. I've noticed that when we are on the outside of charismatic relationships, a lot of us, even totally secular people, tend to resort to religious or hypnotism metaphors. We use words like mesmerize, magnetize. We talk about a leader converting followers to a cause. And I think this is because charisma is a concept that we punt to when we can't identify an obvious, rational, kind of quid pro quo relationship between the leader and followers that explains the appeal to us. We have a sense that there is something else going on, and we just don't understand it. This is why the sociologist Max Weber borrowed the term charisma from the world of biblical studies and church history a little bit more than 100 years ago. It comes originally from the ancient Greek word charis, meaning divine anointing, chosenness by the gods. In the New Testament, Paul makes this charisma, he adds the suffix, and it has slightly different meanings in different parts of the New Testament, but generally it means unbidden gift of grace from God. Weber is the one who deserves credit for taking this term, which at the time was, languishing as a sort of a term that you'd know if you were a Bible nerd or sort of in church circles, but otherwise not, and taking it and kind of redefining it as a type of political authority distinct from authority that comes via a leader's position in an institution or relation to tradition or military might. Power that has to do with a leader convincing followers that he or she has some supernatural capability, a power that resides in a special way in the leader as a person. To me, the phenomenon that Weber and secular observers after him have tried to name is actually not all that far from what Paul was naming in the New Testament. I think in both the religious and in the secular sense, charisma is really about the human desire to touch otherworldly power and to find a place in a big, transcendent narrative that lends meaning to your ordinary, puny life and gives you some sense of control over the chaos. Maybe you are not the one in control, but at least you have reasonable confidence that you know where it's headed. And whether you find a leader compelling or revolting depends on whether he or she is offering you an attractive role in the story he's telling. I want to add a caveat here. When I call a leader's message a story, I'm not saying it's necessarily fiction, and that can be a kind of dangerous connotation of story. But humans are storytelling creatures. This is simply how we organize information about the world. The difference between a charismatic leader who is an agent of moral progress and one who is not has everything to do with whether the leader offers a story grounded in reality, maybe inviting followers into a new way of organizing what they already know about the world and reinterpreting their own relationship to it. And on the other hand, there are leaders who are fabulists, who pull back the veil on a pseudo-reality. But my point is that charisma in and of itself is morally neutral. I think this way of approaching charismatic leadership as transcendent storytelling helps a little bit with a problem that scholars and journalists who study religion have been dealing with for a few decades now. And that is an over-reliance on poll data pegged to traditional religious institutions and institutional elites as a way of finding a kind of shorthand to tell us something about what's happening with human religious impulses. And we all know that every year seems to bring a new study that shows that rates of church attendance, membership, and so forth have generally been trending down. I mean, there have been some interesting exceptions in the most recent wave of data showing modest renewal among some demographic categories. We can talk about that later if you're interested. But in general, it's the lines go in one direction. And so these polls are capturing less and less of kind of religious behavior. But I think it's a mistake to assume that the only place the religious impulse lands is in traditional houses of worship. And perhaps instead of assuming that impulse is eroding, vanishing altogether, we need to think about new places to look to find it. And I think one place it's interesting to look is in the relationship between certain leaders and followers. I thought I would tell you a little bit about the later part of my book because it's the most immediately connected to our current political moment. I want to look at a particular kind of charismatic appeal that seems to have real power now, especially in the United States, and think about what it has to do with the human need for religious experience and authority. Let me start with just the basic question of how Americans get their information and develop a narrative of what's happening in the world, because that's the broad context in which any leader who's coming to you with a new story has to operate. So we have tons of poll data, right, saying that Americans have low trust in institutions across the board, from Congress to mainstream media to higher ed. I won't dwell on that. Some folks here are more experts on this topic than I am. Why is this important for the story of charisma? Because these polls tell us about one category of leader that lacks charisma right now, and that's experts. Institutions tend to be full of experts, staffed by experts, in the business of training experts, premised on the idea that you need the approval of fellow experts in your field in order to deserve the trust of the public. And that whole idea is falling apart. I want to suggest to you that the era immediately preceding our own, so from 1945 to the late 1960s, set us up for this in some special ways. That was an era when professional expertise, respect for professional expertise, the charisma of experts, the power of the story that experts were telling about the world, you could say, when it peaked and then began to fall apart. In our own time, then, we have seen the rise of a different type of charismatic leader, and that's a type I call the guru. Now, what's a guru? Number one, a guru tells you to put your trust in him or her as an individual. They may link themselves to an institution or tradition or scripture, but they position themselves as the best interpreter. Second, a guru presents a totalizing worldview. If you accept the assumptions that he or she presents, then you have an answer to every big question about right and wrong, the ultimate goals in life. Number three, that worldview is based on an alternative picture of reality, a new set of facts that are at odds with what outsiders see. And number four, gurus operate adjacent to electoral politics rather than right in it, although sometimes they do make the leap. Before I say more about the guru, I want to talk a little bit about the age of the expert. From 1945 into the 1960s was the heyday of cultural authority for secular scientific expertise in North America. Think about higher education booming after World War II, loads of federal investment in research. A bit later, the technocrats working for John F. Kennedy on economic policy, on Vietnam, pitching the story of the new frontier to Americans, a narrative that essentially said, trust expert-led innovation, expert-led foreign policy, America will spread democracy, spread a higher standard of living, we will get to the moon. I'll add that the 1950s and the early 1960s were also the last time when you could say that traditional religious institutions and religious experts, so to speak, were in charge. This was the last era when liberal Protestant churches were thriving, at least by the numbers. Just to give you one data point, the United Methodist Church had about 11 million members in the mid-60s. Now they're down to about 6 million, which in the context of population growth is really striking, and losing about 200,000 members annually. Another trend I want to flag, it's a bit different, that begins in the post-war era, is the beginning of the charismatic renewal movement, which was an explosion of that older kind of charisma, the New Testament Holy Spirit kind of charisma, in churches that had never known this kind of thing before, at least in this miraculous, sensory way, hands up in the air, speaking in tongues, people getting slain in the Spirit. These revivals spread around the world. You could argue they are still spreading. And in some ways, charismatic renewal did breathe new vitality into established institutions. I mean, one of the key early nodes of this revival was among middle-class Episcopalians in the LA area. The Catholic Church, after a brief kind of hesitation, really embraced charismatic renewal. At the same time, though, I think you could argue that charismatic renewal chipped away at the authority of more traditional Christian institutions, as revivals often do, and emboldened over the long term independent, non-denominational megachurch pastors, religious entrepreneurs, rather than older groups and denominations. You probably also associate the 50s and 60s with the rise of the counterculture, certainly a movement driven by skepticism of institutions. My point is that by the 1960s, we have a complicated picture. The experts, the educated establishment church leaders still seem fairly comfortable in their cultural authority, but this is starting to erode if you kind of know what to look for. Now let me give you a snapshot from the end of this period when this erosion starts to give way to kind of full-on collapse. This was a moment in my research where I really saw the value of putting the narrative of mainstream political history alongside the history of the supernatural religious movements that scholars tend to keep sort of cordoned off. So let's zoom in to one place in time, 1970, Southern California, specifically UCLA. Picture Angela Davis striding across campus. She's 26 years old. She's a proud member of the Communist Party. She's just coming off a stint in Germany doing doctoral work in Marxist philosophy. And she's come back to the States to get involved with the Black Panthers. UCLA hired her to teach a few classes on the side while she's finishing her dissertation. She likes to teach in a miniskirt, her natural hairstyle framing her face in a perfect sphere, and she just packs in the students. I mean, they adore her. After she dismisses class, they crowd around the podium, working up the nerve to ask questions. And they're not the only ones who hang around. Protesters hang around too. You can find middle-aged Czech refugees, members of the local chapter of Young Americans for Freedom. At this moment, Ronald Reagan is governor, so he's on the UC Board of Regents ex officio, and they are trying to get Davis fired. There are death threats. She has to get a bodyguard. At one point, some vigilante character breaks into the philosophy building looking for her and assaults the department chair. Now, what's the story that she's telling? From a certain angle, it's the Marxist arc of history, the coming class war. But Davis is also pitching legions of students on a story about institutions. She has worked, as many of them have, into the heart of the ivory tower as a PhD student, and she is using academia's own platforms to declare the whole system illegitimate. It's a version, I think, of that shift to seeing institutions as a stage for performance that Yuval Levin described in A Time to Build. Now, just a short walk away from the UCLA philosophy classrooms, you'd find a very different scene in an old frat house. The frat boys are gone. It's been taken over by a group called the Jesus Christ Light and Power Company, which is a Christian commune run by a former Campus Crusade worker, a guy named Hal Lindsey. He's usually in a tank top, blue jeans, leather boots, talking to college kids in a Texas drawl about the rapture, the coming of the Antichrist. It's 1970, so he has just published his famous book, The Late Great Planet Earth, all about the coming apocalypse. This frat house is a key outpost of the Jesus People movement, which is a mix of disillusioned hippies and middle-class kids fleeing their parents' churches. And it's a movement that in many ways grew out of established institutions, but it loathes institutions. Let me read you Hal Lindsey talking to a reporter. He says, "These kids hate impersonalness, bigness, irrelevance, materialism. And I've just given you a description of the average institutional church." Now, I'm not saying that the Jesus freaks and the student activists rallying for Angela Davis are one unified movement. But I am saying that the Jesus freaks seeking the Holy Spirit and the charismatic relationship that Davis has with her followers are on a continuum. They are related responses to the same cultural situation. They reflect a shared sense of being fed up with the cosmos. They're full of young people who've been shaped by institutions that have let them down. And they're hungry for a new eschatology, an account of how all this injustice is going to end. There's a way in which it's these young people, shaped by, working inside institutions, but feeling betrayed by them, who help tear down the authority of universities and the authority of the quote-unquote mainstream churches. Given this, it makes sense, I think, that the late 60s and the 70s were an age of new religious movements, ranging from the infamous and scary ones like Jim Jones' People's Temple to those movements that were sometimes benign, sometimes a bit cult-like the evangelical charismatic Children of Love, the Guru Maharaji's Divine Light Mission. Now, these movements varied tremendously in theology and practice, but they all orbited around a guru, a charismatic leader who could look at you and make you feel seen. Like all of your problems are suddenly out in the open and acknowledged as real and serious, and they mean something. They are part of a bigger picture, which you can understand if you're willing to come along and understand this new way of seeing the world. I'll just flag, too, the cliches of this era, which should be floating in our brains, right? This is the era of deep disillusionment over the Vietnam War, Watergate. By the time we're in the 1970s, the decline of mainline church attendance is undeniable. Now, scholars like to zoom out and call the big picture here secularization, which is a term we tend to use mainly in the context of religion. But to me, secularization is not about the decline of the religious impulse. It's eroding trust in institutions in general, which is a category that includes churches, and the transfer of that religious impulse somewhere else. By the time we get to the 1980s, the guru is not a leadership model that we see only on the margins. This model of authority takes off in the self-help industry, in leadership studies programs in business schools, where the trendy message is that your boss is not some lofty person above you in the hierarchy, but comes alongside you as your coach and is going to help you become your most authentic self. Find a kind of spiritual fulfillment by aligning your personal mission with the mission of your employer. There's also that interesting mix of self-help and televangelism that you see in Oprah Winfrey, who is just becoming a national figure at this time. Her show gets syndicated in 1986. And I'd argue you see hints of it in a brash New York businessman who goes on Oprah's show a couple of times and speculates about running for president, Donald Trump. Two things make charismatic leaders more compelling, you could argue more dangerous in our current era. In the past, institutions and traditions were stronger and I think provided a counterweight, an alternative context, a source of identity for people trying to evaluate the story that a leader is pitching to them. Second, the cultural authority of organized religion has been on the retreat for at least 2 generations. This has fed both a crisis of meaning and a tendency to transfer religious impulses, yearning for transcendent ultimate meaning to other spheres, specifically politics. It's done something else too, though, and this is important. It's fed a crisis of confidence among the lay people and leaders who have stuck with the traditional churches. And when you're feeling insecure about your place in culture, you're going to be extra vulnerable when a leader comes along promising you political power. The history of charismatic leaders in this country and their influence now only becomes legible, I think, if we are willing to pose essentially theological questions. What is the transcendent narrative that this leader is offering? What does salvation look like here? How has this leader taken the feeling of being in a tribe to the feeling of a holy remnant, right? Which is different, has a different kind of power. One more thing I'll just throw out there. We are seeing Pentecostal and Holy Spirit-oriented Catholic and Anglican churches growing, especially among young people across the West. What might we learn if we entertain the possibility that secular and religious people are not so different? That the contact with supernatural order and power that these young converts are seeking has at least a family resemblance to the promise of transcendence that you find in some varieties of politics on both the left and the right. Max Weber is one of my heroes, and I think I'm channeling him a little bit when I say that secular scholars and journalists need theology, not to assert dogmatic prescriptions, but to ask interesting questions. Thanks.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Joshua Katz, and like my friend and colleague Tim Carney, I'm a senior fellow here at the American Enterprise Institute. Molly, as you know, I have tried since before this book came out to get you here, and all of you have just heard that great talk, so I think you know why I wanted this to work. That's not funny. I'm not sure what's going on out there. So here's what's going to happen. Molly and I are going to have a conversation for a little while. Then I'm going to throw things open to the audience for questions. I should say that in addition to the people in this room, we have people watching online. If you're watching online, I cannot promise I will get to any question you may have, but if you do have one, you can send it in to Sean Doolin. That's Sean, S-E-A-N, Doolin, D-O-O-L-A-N, .aei, at aei.org. Okay, so Molly, this is just a great book. You said in your talk something which is on page 263 of the book. You can all pick one up. Charisma depends on telling a good story, and you've told a really good story about a good story. You really have to read this. The book is tremendously well written, and at the same time tells a truly compelling and interesting story. It does two things that are very, very hard to combine. It brings a big picture attention together with an extraordinary kaleidoscope of vignettes. When you read individual pages, you see character after character after character described lovingly and beautifully, and you don't maybe quite know where it's going page to page. But after you get about 5 pages in, you begin to see the arc. And the arc makes its way all the way through. Molly, in her talk just now, concentrated on the relatively recent years. She concentrated on the ages of experts and the age of experts and the age of gurus. But there are 5 ages in this book, which goes, as you can see, from Puritans to Donald Trump. It goes from prophets to conquerors to agitators to experts to gurus. The arc is really remarkable, and I recommend it to you highly. So here's the first thing I want to ask you. The book is explicitly American. I mean, the word American is even in the subtitle. How important is that? I mean, charisma presumably exists outside America as well. And while we're at it, the book is also not explicitly, but very Christian. And not only is it Christian, but it is, or Christian inflected, let me put it like that, but it is American Christian inflected. And not only is it American Christian inflected, but it is very heavily inflected by those peculiar strains of American Christianity known as evangelical Protestantism. So the sort of larger question, and please take this in any direction you like, is how important is it that this is an American story, both the charisma itself and the idea of the religious charisma,
Yeah, this is a great question, and something I had many spicy arguments about with colleagues who study other cultures. I do think that there are broad features of the charismatic relationship between leaders and followers that point us to aspects of the human experience that I would be comfortable saying are universal. I do think that the hunger for a relationship to a transcendent narrative is a universal feature of how we operate. It's one of the things that makes humans more interesting than other animals. This way in which we are often doing things that are not in our immediate material interest, and we're drawn to these big stories about meaning. However, the story I'm telling is one that is uniquely American, because it is, in many important respects, a story about the aftermath of the Protestant Reformation and the outworking of certain impulses in the Reformation in their most extreme metastasized form in the American context. And in some respects, evangelical Protestants and Pentecostals are the most, they take that logic, they take that Reformation logic to its extreme. Now, what I mean, without romanticizing the tranquility of the medieval Catholic Church, which certainly had its share of dissenters and clashes over authority and all kinds of things, there is a way in which the basic charismatic economy, in the sense of claims to power directly from the Spirit and who gets to have it and who doesn't, worked with a kind of stability for many centuries. The Catholic Church had ways of, okay, we've got this fellow who's criticizing the Pope a little bit too loudly. Well, let's let him found his own religious order. We have this lady who's having mystical visions. Well, let's get her just a diplomatic father confessor who can, make sure she doesn't tread any of the lines around orthodoxy. More or less worked. And in addition to this, in medieval Catholic experience, and I think Catholic experience to this day, there are all sorts of doors and windows by which the layperson can access the divine in a kind of controlled, predictable way that more or less stays stable. Martin Luther was no anarchist by any means. And it's easy, I think, for people in a modern democratic context to exaggerate that, to sort of project their own fantasies onto him. Certainly when he saw German peasants taking his criticisms of the Catholic Church to, into a political message, he got quite exercised. He wrote this famous tract in the context of the Peasants' War against the thieving and murderous hordes of peasants, right? Saying, rein it in. There are two kingdoms. You should not be disturbing the earthly kingdom. And he, of course, thought that his whole idea was submission to biblical authority as he understood it. But there is in Luther's key insight that your salvation depends not on any kind of economy of grace in which you work, but rather it is God's arbitrary decision to change your status. And it has everything to do with your internal personal relationship with God. There is the seed of this powerful individualism and this emphasis on personal conscience and personal relationship to the divine that takes on a life of its own long after Luther. And it takes on a particular form in the kind of, spectrum of, in many cases, religiously motivated European immigrants who are among the first European settlers of what become the United States, who then, I think, go on to create a landscape that is uniquely unregulated. The First Amendment and the Establishment Clause are totally sui generis for their time in breaking apart the relationship between at least the federal government and free conscience. And while it is still very much a Protestant culture with certain cultural guardrails and in some cases legal guardrails, there's a way in which this logic that I think has an intellectual component as well as these demographic factors, it creates a religious marketplace that is more nurturing of spiritual entrepreneurs than I think any other peer culture. And so there is a way in which these factors shape a culture in which I think both charisma in the New Testament sense and charisma in this kind of different kind of political authority they have a resonance and a power in the American context that is special.
Right. I mean, the word charisma, here it's in the subtitle. Everybody in this room knows the word charisma. You're going to get it redefined in this book, which is one of the reasons you have to go off and read this book. But just roughly speaking, what Molly does is take Weber's use of this word, and Weber's use of this word did not exist in English 100 years ago, and now this is a word that everybody knows or everybody thinks that he or she knows. Everybody thinks, yeah, you know, sure, I know vaguely what charisma is. Now, actually, it's not clear that everybody does know what charisma is, because as you pointed out in your talk, charisma and charm are not the same thing. In the book, there's a great distinction between the two. I'm sorry you didn't say this up there, but charisma is a relationship and charm is a personality trait. I think that's a great line. But I bring this up because I've conducted a little unscientific poll in recent days, and I've asked people, a very wide range of people, to tell me about people they consider to be charismatic. And I think in many cases they're probably talking about charming people, but nonetheless I've asked people, so whom do you consider to be charismatic? I don't have to know who they are. They don't have to be famous. I just want to know who these people are. Maybe they're teachers, maybe they're religious leaders, who knows, whatever they may be. And almost every single answer, do you know what I'm going to say? Said by almost every single person has been a male. And if you then Google charisma, male, charisma, masculinity, charisma, toxic masculinity, stuff like this, you see that this is a real trope out there. But one of the remarkable things about this book is that women play a very large role. They play a very large role from the very first sentence. Anne Hutchinson, and well, you talked about Angela Davis of all people. There are all sorts of women in this book. So tell me about women in charisma and why it is that my unscientific poll, and I will confess publicly that if I'd been asked, I suspect that all or most of my answers would have been men too. I mean, I will say that. Why is that? What's going on?
Yeah, it's something that I've thought a lot about, and I have seen that same pattern in our contemporary landscape. And even when I think about my own training in high school forensics and the practices I was encouraged to adopt to be an effective public speaker, I suppose they could be seen as sort of male-coded kinds of presentation and a way of standing and commanding the room. I think women who are taller, who can speak in a lower vocal range, are often have an easier time gaining an audience. This was a fascinating thing I noticed about Angela Davis, who, as a young woman, had this tremendous ability, despite the fiery emotion with which she described the world on fire that she saw. If you watch old footage of her, she is absolutely calm and collected, not a bead of sweat, does not raise her voice, commits none of the sort of lady linguistic sins of upspeak or any of these things that are seen to kind of diminish authority. Despite her miniskirts, right, and her deliberately quite feminine self-presentation, she has a kind of masculine confidence, which I don't think is an accident. I think there are broad ways in which sociologically we respond, and whether you want to divert to theories of evolutionary psychology or some other explanation, we respond to these male-coded styles of communication, which I think are part of how charisma can work itself out in an encounter with a particular leader, but it's definitely not the full story. I found myself writing about more women who were charismatic leaders in the earlier period of my book, long before second wave feminism. I think this is because charisma is often, it's the authority of the weak. It's the way you seek power if you don't have ready access to an institutional role. You don't have an army at your command. You don't have a tradition that is anointing you as a worthy occupant of a particular role. So very frequently, the people you see making an end run or attempting an end run around the hierarchy of their time, and also the people who are aware of some community in their midst that is not satisfied with the narratives on offer in the culture. Often, these are women, these are non-white people, these are people with radical political or religious views who are on the margins in some way or another. And this is why I think, beginning with the Puritan heretic Anne Hutchinson, as special as her story is, in many ways it's emblematic of certain features of charisma. I found actually as I went on in history, especially when I got to this final era from the late 60s to our current time, the age of the gurus, I found it harder and harder to find women I was drawn to writing about. And I think that's because when given the option, most women do the sensible thing and they go into the institution. And they take the least risky path to influence. Now, how that plays out, I think, can have unexpected consequences. I'm fascinated by the roles of women in, on the one hand, mainline Protestant denominations, where they can do everything, they can be ordained, they can be in every role in the bureaucracy, and the role of evangelical Protestant women on the Bible teaching circuit. And in some cases also the wives of pastors who have a social media following. And in some ways their authority is far more ephemeral and fragile, but it is much more in your face. And from a certain angle, they have a lot more direct influence on their audiences than the woman who is toiling away at the top of the Episcopalian hierarchy in a sort of unseen capacity. So that relationship between actual influence and the security of your power can be a complicated one. And I think these are some lenses that help us see the role of sex and gender in charismatic leadership broadly.
So perhaps I could follow up with a personal question. It's conventional in conversations like this to ask the author to say, so how did you get into this project in the first place? And usually that doesn't lead to very interesting answers, but I suspect that in this case it will, because in the course of writing this book, you very publicly came out as Christian. Can you tell us something about the history of this book and you?
Yes, I can try. I grew up totally secular. I was about 2/3 of the way through drafting this book when I was doing a magazine story about a local Southern Baptist megachurch pastor, and he evangelized me, and I had not been evangelized before, which is sort of interesting to reflect on when I think that I'd spent nearly 2 decades as a researcher, interviewing loads of Christians in various capacities. But evangelism is a taboo subject and a taboo endeavor in our culture, right? It's deeply offensive to tell someone that you have an exclusive truth claim and they should change their mind about how the universe works. So it doesn't happen very often, even among conservative Christians. And in this case, there are long versions of the story I've told on the internet if you're interested in the details. This pastor sent me down a long, intense period of research in which I read, to my shame for the first time, much of the really excellent scholarship on the historical claims that Christians make, particularly about the resurrection. I did not have any sort of mystical experience, but I got to the point where even to just stick with the standards of my kind of pragmatist understanding of myself as someone who is willing to revise my working hypothesis of the universe based on new evidence, if I was willing to suspend my belief in the supernatural, which I realized on greater reflection I was really not entitled to. I had just sort of adopted it from the waters I swam in, but those waters were just as sort of culturally specific as any. Then I came to the sort of grudging conclusion that the resurrection was the best explanation for a very strange set of facts, and that meant that I had to take Jesus at his word, that he is who he says he is. So I accidentally found myself a member of a Southern Baptist megachurch, which is not, I always thought if this happened, it would happen in respectable, incense-filled Anglo-Catholic context. But God had to humble me in, I think, a very specific way. And I was evangelized by really two pastors, my pastor, J.D. Greer, and then Tim Keller, late of Redeemer Church, he was dying of cancer at the time, but I met with him on Zoom, and he was really critical. So in a sense, I was evangelized by these two gurus. Like that is certainly how this could scan to a skeptical outsider, and I have many of them in my life. But this was a sort of very personal situation that compelled me to ponder this. You know, what is my response to my many atheist friends on this point? And I think it helped me discern the difference between, I think, an effective and generally positive charismatic leader and one who leads you down dangerous paths. And that is that in both cases, these pastors, they invited me into a story, right? I mean, for Christians, this is the ultimate story. And they did not present themselves as, final authority gatekeepers, but rather position themselves more like a Virgil to my Dante, kind of being ready to go along with me as I was investigating this. And you have these questions. Well, let's explore this rich tradition and avail ourselves of its resources. And let me introduce you to other Christians who can answer your questions, right? That's not what a guru does. I will say, too, that my own conversion prompted me to reflect that, I had my whole career, since being an undergraduate, had this sense that humans are fundamentally religious. And I was always sort of aware that I was drawn to being a historian of religion as a way of sidling up alongside this thing I couldn't figure out how to break into through the front door. But also, if the lesson I'm drawing from my survey of the history in this book is that humans want to be in a story. The book is not, it's not a work of autobiography, but at the same time, if I'm making this grand claim about human nature, why would I think I am an exception? Absolutely not. And I suppose the final thing I'll say is that my own reconsideration of the blinkers that I have lived between when it comes to the supernatural, especially as I read more and more about contemporary claims of miraculous healing, not just in the global South, but here as well. It made me reflect. I certainly didn't deviate from the usual sort of hands-off methodology that secular historians stick to when they're talking about trances and possession and tongues and so forth. But it certainly made me reflect on that as a set of choices that we make, and it has, in research since then, it has sort of gotten me interested in putting myself in the way of the Holy Spirit and trying to figure it out.
Okay, so you're an expert who's been evangelized by gurus, which then leads me to ask a sort of complicated series of questions. Take these any way you want. One is, what's the future of expertise in the age of the guru? Second, well, you wrote this. This book went into press last year, I guess, just after Donald Trump was reelected. This, of all weeks, it seems impossible not to ask you to comment on the current guru-like status of Donald Trump, this of all weeks especially. And perhaps to me most interestingly, sure, historians don't always look into the future, but you've described 5 ages. What's the 6th age going to be? What's going to come after the guru?
Oh, man.
You don't have to answer that,
Yeah,
but take any of those you want. Look, I couldn't not ask about Trump, because if I don't, somebody else is going to.
He's in the subtitle.
Yeah, exactly.
You wouldn't be doing your job.
I could ask about Puritans too, but well.
That's true.
Yeah.
I'm reluctant to, I'm following with great fascination these waves of data that from Pew and other places that show this modest but significant uptick in church-going and conversion and sort of religious engagement by millennials and Gen Z, especially young men, not only in the United States, but in the UK and in some other places where we do have some data. France, Finland, I think, has some good studies. And it's important to not exaggerate this. I think that's a temptation, especially for people who an atheist colleague of mine calls the Christian survivalists, who their measure of success is the numbers, right? At the same time, when I put these big picture demographic bits and pieces of partial information in conversation with my anecdotal conversations with my students at UNC. The big picture I take away is one of young people who are increasingly skeptical of the story they've been told by their culture, that the path to happiness and human flourishing is one of radical independence and self-actualization, that happiness is a matter of identifying the little golden flame that burns inside you and nurturing it into a raging fire and sundering from yourself any obligation or anything that might quench that fire that you should be nurturing, and that it is a pure thing. It is in no way handed to you by your culture. It has a sort of timeless transcendence. But I see more and more young people seeing that is actually not a path to satisfaction, feeling deeply lonely, beginning to see that their glowing rectangle is not this great agent of empowerment, but one of isolation. And I think that this is a great deal of what is compelling some of these young people to find their way to not just institutions, but the weirdest institutions, the ones that are the most countercultural, that stand athwart the kind of claims of supremacy of the reigning priests of science, and say, actually, there are components to the human experience that you scientists don't know anything about. And come see. So, does that mean that we've hit sort of peak guru, and we're on a path to some kind of recovery? I wouldn't go that far. I mean, I think it is much easier to burn things down than it is to rebuild them. And we're really at a crossroads. And with many of these younger converts, I think they could sort of go either way. There's a version of their future, their religious political journey that is deeply politicized, that leans into tribe and revenge, and is really, frankly, not Christianity. And then there's a healthy version. Now, on Trump, I think the lens of charisma is a powerful one for understanding his base and certain relationships he has with certain constituents. But I think it's also important to say that people, as with any candidate, people voted for Trump for all kinds of reasons. And I wouldn't want the lens of charisma to become an excuse for critics of Trump to kind of dismiss any Trump voter and their interests as somehow not rational, right? So I know too many people who voted for him, not because of any kind of personal feeling of being compelled and magnetized, but rather because abortion is the issue they vote on, or because they've been so let down by institutions and they associate the Democrats with this dysfunctional establishment. And what a gift for the Democrats to hand Trump, to nominate Kamala Harris, the establishment candidate in many ways. I think there is also reality to those voters for whom there's a sort of narrow set of economic drivers. That said, I think one can only appreciate the political genius of Trump if you see him in terms of these stories that he has woven together over the course of his whole public life, beginning in the early 1980s, that complement each other and then translated into a story about the country. And I mean both the story of himself as a businessman who, despite constant efforts to screw him over and ruin his quest to simply get what's his, he managed to work the system, and he will get revenge on anyone who crosses him. And the way that personal story can become one of claiming vengeance for the anonymous little guy. But there is woven into that his own spiritual story, right? I mean, people often comment on how Trump is, by most measures, not an Orthodox Christian, which I think is true. But he is a child of a very particular stream of Christianity, and that's the Christian expression of the prosperity gospel, right? I mean, his childhood pastor was Norman Vincent Peale, the power of positive thinking guy, the grandfather of Christian prosperity thinking. And that whole tradition of really a confidence in the power of mind to reshape reality, to speak new reality into existence. I mean, it is a way of approaching the world that Trump comes by naturally, and it is, in many ways, one of the, the dominant spiritual streams in this country whose influence extends well beyond Christianity. And I think it gave him a natural fellow feeling with that constituency of conservative Protestants that has become so important for his rise to power, and that's independent charismatics like Paula White Cain and people in that category. So, I mean, I think there is both a way in which Trump's alliance with them is a fairly cynical one of seeking common ends. But there is also a piece of it that is motivated by an understanding of the universe he comes by honestly. Like, both can be true at once.
Yeah, I'm going to ask one more quick question because I just can't resist, and that's again about your profession and the fact that we may not yet be at peak guru and peak Trump. So if there is a profession where expertise really matters to its practitioners, God help us, it's academia. And we know that academia is kind of in trouble at the moment thanks to the peak gurus and thanks, by the way, also internally to the so-called experts. So what's the future of history departments, major universities, academia generally?
I'm worried. I think the current assault on higher ed is only possible because higher ed has lost the trust of so many Americans. And I am first in line to criticize so many of the dynamics that conservative critics have noted in higher ed. I'm not persuaded that any of the current efforts underway to correct those dynamics are headed for success. I think seems to be inherent in the human species that we are incapable of modest course correction. We always swing wildly in the other direction. I think there's a bit of that going on. But at the same time, I take a lot of encouragement from my interactions with students who, despite all the reasons to be deeply cynical about the world and not believe in truth and kind of give up on doing anything but earning a decent paycheck, they actually do want to know what's true. And they are hungry for older folks with some claim to know something about something to give them unsolicited advice about what to do with their lives. And so, I don't know. I don't think I'm unusual in trying more and more to cross that boundary and have these conversations about ultimate meaning that I hope assert the stakes of what higher ed can be at its best. I think the only prayer for higher education is to reclaim universities' historic strength as a counterculture. And I don't mean counterculture in any kind of left-wing sense. I mean counterculture in a broad intellectual, cultural sense of doing work that is not obviously of immediate market value, that seems to run contrary to the incentives offered to you by the rest of the culture, that pulls you out of that culture so that you are better equipped to be useful in the marketplace. I think there is actually a mercenary argument for this approach, but that's not the main reason for it. I think there is an inherent conservatism to the job of the university rightly ordered that is perfectly compatible with loads of left-wing professors running around. But there's a commitment to conserving, the study of dead languages and the reading of great books and so forth. And I hope that we're on the edge of a correction in that direction.
What a great answer. You're going to turn that answer into a New York Times op-ed, something you do so well. Okay, questions in the audience, please.
As someone who came of age in the 2010s, I've noted a phenomenon that was going on throughout the last decade and seems to have mostly sort of finished. It's in its final state now of everything, whether it be a religious movement or something as simple as a hobby, a group of fans of something, everything that once was not necessarily ideologically coded has now either fallen into one specific ideological camp, roughly aligned with left or right, or has split into two of those. And it seems like a lot of this has had to do with gurus, with charismatic leaders, whether that be the current president or anyone else. But as someone who has lived through it, I'm not certain of the causes, and I wonder if you would comment on that phenomenon, if you see that happening, if you think that's a real phenomenon, and if so, how that relates to charisma and gurus.
I absolutely see that phenomenon, and I think the politicization of every facet of life is the corollary of Westerners' diminished engagement with traditional spaces in which they would seek transcendent meaning. So if you are not finding a satisfactory transcendent story in a house of worship or a religious or philosophical tradition, you are liable to make an idol of your social media feed, the car you drive, and what the brand signals about your associations with on a whole host of other issues. I think too this is related to it's of a piece with the polarization of the country and the way in which we are all being trained to divide into camps of us versus them and to seek shorthand, right? I mean, this is something that humans do to navigate the world naturally. It's a healthy psychological tactic to look for shortcuts. But I think we are in a place now where we use almost everything as a shortcut, for making assumptions about a person's views on everything else. And it manifests in academia, and I hear frequently graduate students who maybe are outside the kind of narrow left-leaning spectrum of typical opinions for humanities grad students, but their fellows in their cohort see their location, around the seminar table, and take that as proof positive that they must have X, Y, and Z view on every political issue, and then make all kinds of assumptions. So I think the phenomenon you're describing and the rise of these charismatic leaders, they're both responses to this kind of meaning crisis and this vacuum.
The back.
Thank you for this wonderful discussion. So one of the most important mainline traditions, Methodism, comes out of this moment of great evangelical fervor, the Second Great Awakening. So it's an example of, this spiritual energy institutionalizing over the course of the 19th century. What might it look like for the charismatic tradition to possibly institutionalize in the 21st century?
That is one of the great rhythms of religious history, right? One of my favorite books is by the Oxford Don and Roman Catholic priest Ronald Knox, called, this book, called Enthusiasm. And it's all about this. And it locates that kind of institutionalization in the early modern period in this long tradition of the ebb and flow of the sect that turns into a stodgy denomination that then gives birth to frustrated sectarians, and so it goes. So at some level, that's the rhythm that we always see and can look for. Although sometimes these charismatic movements just burn out, right? They effloresce, and with the death or the fatal demotion of the leader, at least in the immediate material sense, they don't go anywhere. Now, I think understanding and judging the ultimate impact and legacy of a charismatic movement requires some flexibility on time horizon. So, when I think about some of the characters I write about who, in the most straightforward sense, were failures, whether it's Anne Hutchinson, who has this brief period of influence over Puritan Massachusetts Bay, but as soon as the disciplinary machinery of the colony get into motion, she's pretty quickly put on trial and banished. But she has this long, I think, legacy that helps us understand the shape of evangelicalism and the emphasis on kind of the personal relationship to the divine. Or I think about Marcus Garvey, the Pan-Africanist leader, whose movement, the Universal Negro Improvement Association, at its apogee in the late teens and early 20s, is this amazing spectacle of parades and rallies of thousands and thousands of uniformed people. But again, when he is imprisoned and deported, it seems to sort of die down unless you zoom forward and think about the fact that a couple of Garveyites are the parents of Malcolm Little, who becomes Malcolm X, right? Who then plays such an important role in that later generation of Black nationalism. You can begin to think about influence differently. I think we are seeing an interesting moment of potential institutionalization or its absence among these independent, charismatic churches that have such influence right now, not just in the United States, but worldwide. Because their explosion and the fact that none of them are establishing denominations that bear any real structural resemblance to the Methodist and Presbyterian formation processes in prior generations, it tells us that I think institutionalization may still happen, but it looks different. So these independent charismatic churches, they form networks. Any church that is under the moniker New Apostolic Reformation, right? That describes actually networks of affiliations that can be quite fluid and combine sometimes a kind of very powerful top-down authoritarian influence by a board of elders or one individual with a radical democratic ability to shift and accommodate different international contexts. I think that this has prevented a sort of structure of healthy checks and balances and reference to Christian tradition from maybe reining in some of the, I hesitate to say excessive, but some of the particularly powerful supernatural impulses that manifest in these churches. So, belief in demons and exorcism is absolutely in the mainstream of Christian orthodoxy, right? Even though there's plenty of Western Christians who don't want to hear that. That is a normal thing to believe if you're a Christian. But there is such, because humans are depraved, there is such a temptation when you give them the intellectual and ritual machinery to turn their enemies into demons and act accordingly, that you need the ballast of, say, what is offered in the Catholic Church. I think a structure for thinking that through and interrogating it and approaching it with the help of religious experts. And that is a structure that is absent in these independent charismatic contexts. And there is then the temptation to seek that structure in politics, where I think it becomes easily weaponized. So I'm worried about that, and I think institutionalization is inevitable, but it almost certainly will look different than it looked in prior generations.
Time for one more quick question, please, in green.
Hi, my name is Bailey. Thank you so much for coming to speak with us today. As you were talking about gurus earlier and kind of laying out your description of them, I'm reminded of influencers on social media and building their following. Even though we might never meet them or might never see them in our lives, like in person, we still decide that they're good enough that we're going to listen and get our information from them. And it kind of seems like a pseudo charisma in a way, because a lot of times they're posting for their own needs to make money, or they like posting or that creative outlet. Can you speak on that kind of phenomenon, and maybe is this the next wave of gurus?
Yeah, I love this question, especially because the language of the internet guides us to it, right? We are encouraged, if you do something as passive as simply clicking like, you are then a follower, right? And that's a word that had a much more active meaning in older contexts, which gives me pause. I don't think it's useful to cast any TikTok influencer with a lot of followers as a charismatic leader of the sort who can mobilize a mass movement, which is the sense in which I am particularly interested in it. And I think one of the great lies and dangers of the social media revolution and the hazard it poses to democracy is the fact that it can imbue something as passive and malformed as sitting on your couch in your pajamas and scrolling as an active work of following and joining of movement. I mean, that's not what it is. I think it's an incapacitating of people, which isn't to say it doesn't have political significance. But I think that where you are really onto something is in the outsized role that these social media figures can play in the picture we form of the universe. Because we can become so easily siloed and trained by the algorithms and the incentive mechanisms of the relationship of Meta's programmers with our dopamine receptors, right? To tune out unwelcome sources of facts and home in on a fairly narrow set of people shaping our world. And we don't have the same we don't have a healthy ecosystem of cultural institutions and sources of information in which we can evaluate the truth claims that these kinds of figures are making. And so I think we are in a place where there is an outsized power in the realm you're describing, and it is possible to make the leap to avenues of greater kind of real-world political impact than it once was. I mean, there's no analogy. One of the main lessons I took from my research is that as important as the internet is, and it is, the history of mass media, every mass media revolution is so important for understanding the authority of charismatic leaders, because mastery of whatever the cutting edge technology for transmitting your story is a necessary but not sufficient criteria for effectively creating a movement. So as important as it is, I think we tend in our 21st century moment to exaggerate the degree to which the advent of the internet is this hard line that separates us from everyone who came before. And that actually the story of the human experience is one of continuity. And we have a lot more in common with the Puritans of the 1600s and their hungers and anxieties and desires than we might agree to admit. And so many of the dynamics that we see today did not begin with the internet, but rather were simply accelerated by it. So there is something simultaneously deeply discouraging about studying this history, because these dynamics turn out to be so ancient. But it does make me feel less lonely to know that I have this company in previous centuries.
Well, please, as you leave, please take a book, please read the book, and please join me in thanking Molly Worthen, who, at least by any normal definition of the word charismatic, characterizes it.